necessarily because the clock is automatic with the system. It's connected to the video feed, so it's not right now. If you look at our website, yeah, if you stay here, you will see it. And then you can touch around. Yeah. So you there's our channel. It's our channel. It's our channel. Okay, that's cool.
We've got one here only. Why do people do that?
Oh, I know.
Why do people do one here only? Yeah? Listen out for me.
He synchronizes everything. Red car, green car, white car. Yeah, that's nice for me.
He's only gone and done one here
Coordinates
only.
everything for them.
Very bizarre.
They have the Q&A very early. Crawl through. It's your speaking. You know where to download it? Media Library. Oh, yes. Okay. 30 seconds.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending this talk. We're going to have yet another session on geoengineering in the attempt to solve this climate crisis. And today we're going to discuss ocean pasture restoration and the new paradigm. So we are the Climate Emergency Forum, and we're happy to bring this program to you. Today I'm going to be introducing Peter Fikowski. Peter Fikowski is an MIT-trained physicist and entrepreneur, committed to leaving a world we're proud of to our children. This commitment has driven his work on multiple climate initiatives, including founding the Foundation for Climate Restoration and helping launch the Citizens Climate Lobby. He is also founder and president of Automated Visual Inspection, or AVI LLC, and he holds 27 patents. So, Peter, it's all yours.
Yeah, thank you. So it's really a privilege to be here, being on stage with a real rock star. This is the first for me, so thanks. So, it's almost never said, but the reason we're all here is to give our children and future generations a climate that humans have survived and flourished long term. And producing that climate is what we call climate restoration. And the main thing, let me tell you, is that climate restoration is possible. You just asked me, well, if it were possible, wouldn't we be doing it? And the answer is we would be doing it if we said that's our goal. And what's great in this session is we'll be talking about a method of getting to climate restoration so that we can comfortably say we are going to restore a climate that humans have survived for our children. So a few years ago, I had a discussion. I was talking to a former Secretary of Energy at the US, a Nobel laureate in physics. I asked him if we should pursue climate restoration. And you may relate to this. And he said, no, it's too expensive. And I was astounded. And then later that month, actually, I was able to talk with one of the world's top development economists. I asked him, since we want to restore the climate for our children, shouldn't we make that our explicit goal? And he thought for about 1/10 of a second and said, no, it's not physically possible. And the light went on. The physicists were blaming the economists were blaming the physicists, and waiting for us to say, no, we're going to make this happen. So today we'll show you that climate restoration is both physically and financially possible. It's even politically possible. It's possible if you share with others that climate restoration is possible and achievable, and insist that corporations, foundations, and even the government can fund it. The government is pretty dysfunctional. It may not fund it. It may be up to foundations where families say, this is what we want to have happen. And the government may turn over and say, yes, we actually are going to do it. But we don't have to have the government do it. It would be nice. Restoring the climate will require removing 1 trillion tons of CO2. How much is 1 trillion tons? It's a lot. That's the amount of CO2 removed by nature repeatedly. 10 times in the last million years, the nature has removed 1 trillion tons of CO2 preceding ice ages. So we know it can be done. Now, we don't want an ice age. We've actually added that much CO2 to the air, so we need to take that much CO2 out and do the same thing that nature did. But we know how to do it, and that's what we'll be talking about in the next few minutes. And so ocean pasture restoration is what we call nature's way of getting 1 trillion tons of carbon out of the atmosphere. We're going to do it 1,000 times faster than nature. And you say 1,000 times? Well, nature didn't have an engineer. Nature didn't have a goal or a checklist or a budget. It was just throwing dice out and happened to do it. We actually know how to do it, and that's what we're going to do. So, Alex, take it from here.
Regina, yeah? Okay.
Yeah, sure. Sounds great.
Okay. Greetings, United Nations and united people. No more doom and no more gloom. We are here to bring you the good news about climate crisis. For 12 years as a climate journalist, I have been interviewing the top scientists and grassroots activists in the field. And I can now see a path to a future where the greenhouse effect will be reduced enough to be manageable, as we indeed remove 1 trillion tons of CO2 by 2050. Tomorrow, my friends will be filling the streets of Glasgow demanding emissions reduction, and I will fight ferociously, shoulder to shoulder with them for that result. But emissions reduction is only half of what we must ask for. And here's why. That 1 trillion tons of extra CO2 that humans have put into the atmosphere already generates enough greenhouse heat to destroy our societies. That means that even if we had a magic wand to reduce future CO2 emissions to 0 tomorrow morning, that would not reduce the greenhouse effect much at all. Therefore, the old paradigm, which says the solution to the climate crisis is only about reducing future CO2 emissions, is clearly false. Obviously, parallel to emissions reduction, we must also remove a whole lot of CO2 from the atmosphere. And I am confident that our new paradigm of climate restoration, featuring ocean pasture restoration, OPR, which removes huge amounts of CO2, combined with the reduction of future emissions, will supersede the old paradigm of utilizing only the reduction of future emissions, which stopped being a viable solution about 50 years ago, actually. In a nutshell, OPR plus emissions reduction will give us a real chance to get the job done. And remember, we are the ocean planet. Most of Earth's biomass is located underwater, and most of our photosynthesis is generated from the oceans. So, while the Amazon forest is famously called the lungs of the planet, historically there have been about 50 Amazon equivalent underwater pastures in the deep ocean which also behave like lungs, as they breathe in CO2 and then give to us most of the oxygen that we all breathe. So, after we do the OPR, those 50 rejuvenated ocean Amazons will be back to their historical strength, and then they will draw down enough CO2 to get us back onto a safe road. And about the cost, OPR does not require billionaires or taxpayer trillions to succeed. Rather, upwards of 100 fishing villages around the world with logistical support from their governments, but not depending on their financial support, will fairly easily find the financing to make it happen, because when the ocean pastures are restored, that restores the plankton populations. And that brings the fish populations back to their historical bountiful levels. Consequently, the value of the fisheries restoration is nearly sufficient to pay for the sustainable replenishment and restoration of the ocean fish pastures. Sir David King, former chief scientific advisor to the UK government, and now the founder and chair of the Center for Climate Repair at Cambridge, he lists OPR as a key natural way to tackle the greenhouse effect problem. And reportedly, his Cambridge group will be sending ships to 3 locations across the world's oceans in the next 4 years to move OPR forward. But don't forget to do the math. Sir David stated that ocean pasture restoration has the potential to remove more than 30 gigatons of CO2 from the atmosphere every year, and that is a huge number, but the world still keeps emitting about 43 gigatons of CO2 per year. Therefore, the polluters will get no excuses from us, and our efforts to reduce emissions must be as relentless as Greta.
Wow. Thank you so much, Alex, for that very informative, interesting, and spirited introduction to this topic. And I don't know if we mentioned that Alex is not only a rock star, but I believe holds the Guinness Book of World Records for playing the longest ever concert. Am I correct?
Longest solo concert, 32 hours of rock and roll without any stopping. Yes.
It's pretty amazing. You can see where he comes by his energy honestly. So thank you so much for that, Alex. And next I'd like to introduce Paul Beckwith. And by way of introduction, Paul is a climate systems scientist who is taught at the University of Ottawa and the Laboratory for Paleoclimatology, as well as at Carleton University. Paul is a well-known climate educator on YouTube with over 1,000 videos pertaining to climate science. So Paul, if you can elucidate a bit more on this topic.
I cede my time to Alex. No, I'm not. Okay. We've lost huge portions of the marine trophic web of ocean life over the last century. 90% of the large fish gone from the oceans is a term that you'll often hear. Within this life, this marine life, there's enormous amounts of carbon that is now missing from the marine life, and it's now warming the planet. It's in the atmosphere and ocean system. The entire marine web is teetering on the brink of collapse. With no life in the oceans, there will be no life on land. The only way to restore the marine food web is to help nature along by building up the lowest, most fundamental level of the web of life in the ocean, namely by restoring ocean plankton to levels to which they were before. So ocean pasture restoration, OPR, is vital for restoring the marine food web balance and take us away from the brink of complete system collapse. Now, it's key that the concept of OPR in deep ocean water be distinguished from phytoplankton growth or blooms in shallow ocean waters over continental shelves, for example. In the Gulf of Mexico is an example. Shallow water blooms are problematic since they result in deoxygenation of the water at the bottom of the ocean in the shallow water, because the decomposition of the phytoplankton occurs, and it creates these, so you get a phytoplankton bloom. The phytoplankton are, they sink to the bottom, or their remnants sink to the bottom, and then they're broken up by bacteria producing deoxygenation. But there's huge amounts of phosphorus and other fertilizers going into the ocean in that location, creating these blooms. So if you do this, I mean, this is totally different. We're doing nothing like this. We're talking about about restoring the plankton in the deep ocean. And open ocean blooms create a proliferation of life all the way up the marine food chain without creating the deoxygenation problem. Because, for example, the deep ocean floor is already anoxic, and descending dead plankton and zooplankton excrement is spread widely before reaching the ocean floor. And this is not theoretical. There's been highly successful trials performed already by Russ George and his teams off the Haida Gwaii Island, and he got a bad rap for that. But we've got direct satellite measurements showing that the phytoplankton blooms created enough food for record salmon runs in Canada for several years following the creation of the phytoplankton blooms. Now, really, OPR is a no-brainer. It has enormous upsides for our climate and well-being. Namely, it creates a huge sink for removing CO2 from the atmosphere-ocean system. Thus, there's a huge reduction of ocean acidification. Plus, it restores the marine web of life to what we had a century ago. And by building up the base of the food chain, we hope we can bring back everything up higher on the food chain. Secondly, it's an excellent hedge for the global food supply, which is facing tremendous stressors and huge risks for land-grown food, right, from extreme weather chaos in our climate casino, as we've previously discussed in conferences. Now, a couple of key things. The iron concentration in open oceans is about 3 parts per trillion, very, very trace amount. Near the coast over continental shelves, it's about 1,000 times higher. It's about 3 parts per million. There's many sources of iron near the coast, including sediments from river runoff, ocean floor sediments being churned up by waves or tidal action, etc. But in deep water, the only source of ocean is dust blown from land, especially deserts. And also when large volcanoes go off, for example, in the last few decades, over 4 volcanoes have gone off in the Aleutian Island chains, and in each of those cases, the volcanic ash contained enough iron to, when it was carried over the ocean, it stimulated phytoplankton blooms. So we know these blooms work.
Thank you so much for that, and thank you for describing the difference between where the seeding will take place. That's very helpful. And now we're going to hear a few words from, you mentioned Russ George, and we're going to hear a few words from the man himself. So if we can cue that tape.
My name is Russ George, and I work on a subject that I've coined the term ocean pasture restoration. And it's all about mainly bringing the fish back, because the ocean are dependent on pastures, just like fish on land, just like livestock on land are dependent on healthy pastures. If you have a healthy pasture, you can have a large number of livestock on land, and in the ocean, if you have a healthy pasture, you can have an abundance of fish. Tragically, the world's pastures are in terrible condition. So the challenge has been to come up with a way to restore the ocean pastures to their historic level of health and abundance. And this image behind me, my background, is an image of the volcano Kasatochi that erupted in Alaska in 2008. And the volcanic ash that carried a trace amount of iron dusted a portion of the Gulf of Alaska. And it was on perfect timing for sockeye salmon of British Columbia. And so in 2010, the sockeye salmon swam back into the Fraser River. Instead of numbering at 1 million fish, they numbered 40 million. So the dust brought the fish back, brought the pastures to life. So that's what I do. I work on projects now around the world. And 2 years ago at the Madrid COP meeting, I was asked in one of these sessions how much it would take to save the world from climate change and bring the ocean pastures back to health. And I said we were working on a project to do 100 ocean pastures with 100 villages around the world. And so since that time, in spite of COVID, I've been plugging away, and we have quite a number of locations in the world that we're working in partnership with governments to develop ocean pasture restoration to bring their fish back. And fish, being a carbon-based life form on Earth, can only grow if carbon dioxide is converted by photosynthesis into plankton, which is the food for ocean life. So we know that those 100 village pastures that we're working to deploy will take out of the world's atmosphere billions of tons of carbon dioxide and repurpose it into new ocean life. And the measure of that will be billions of additional fish that will be put into people's nets and onto their dinner table. So it's a rather wonderful project, and I'm privileged to work on. And I'm so thankful for your group here to hold this session at in Glasgow at COP26.
Okay, so I'm wondering if any of you have something to add or on to what Russ says, and I'd like to pass it to Peter.
Sure. So what's great about this, first of all, I've really devoted my life to having our planet restored to a condition that humans can survive. I think is really important, and I'm guessing the reason you're here in Glasgow and here watching the video is because it's important to you. We need to remove 1 trillion tons of CO2, and with the OPR, just to do some numbers, that the test that Russ did in 2012 removed almost 100 million tons. Now the data has never been published scientifically. The data got lost, but it's also exactly what was predicted by Professor John Martin in 1990 and many others since then. So it's not a surprising number. To get where we want to go would require about 500 of these eddies. And that sounds like a lot. It's only about 1% of the ocean surface to get us all the way back to below 300 parts per million by the year 2050. Now, if that doesn't work quite as well as we hope, and sometimes things do and sometimes things don't, there's another approach, again, based on what nature does, and that is what we call synthetic limestone. Nature has stored 99.9% of all the carbon on our planet on the bottom of the ocean in the form of limestone. Now that took hundreds of millions of years, but again, there was no engineer, no designer, no project manager, no financer. There's a company in Silicon Valley which is doing that same thing, but doing it industrially. So replacing quarried rock, so that instead of quarrying limestone, they're basically pulling the limestone out of the air, just as an oyster does with an oyster shell. It's that complicated. Oysters do it. And that also can scale up with much more effort, but could scale up. And the plan C, is we can do the same thing with kelp. And you can grow kelp out in the ocean. Again, it takes a fair amount of industrial infrastructure, but that also could get all 1 trillion tons out. So the good news is we have plan A, plan B, plan C, and any combination of those will bring us to climate restoration.
Excellent. Well, people often ask why the ocean's capacity for photosynthesis is so much less today compared to its historical norm. Well, let me explain that. When a land farmer tends his pasture, he hopes for enough rainfall. Ocean pastures need dustfall, nutrients delivered via dust in the wind, blown into the oceans from dry land masses. This has been the normal flourishing ecology of the ocean for eons. Unfortunately, there has been a 50-year dustfall drought caused by many of those historically dry land masses getting more and more moist due to the higher levels of CO2 caused by industrialization. Less dust in the wind means less photosynthesis, less life in the ocean pastures, and therefore less CO2 removal. So it's just getting a little more moist on those dry land masses from that CO2 that we've added to the atmosphere has caused this phenomenon. OPR is a process that carefully directs the replacement of those missing amounts of nutrient-rich dust. And after only a short year or two, the pastures are back to their historical norms of robust CO2 removal. So OPR is very eco-friendly, cheap, fast, and safe. And one reason we know it's safe is that Mother Nature for centuries, with her countless volcanoes and dust storms, has deposited essentially the same dust that OPR uses. But while nature's doses are thousands of times larger than OPR's deposits, there has never been a recorded detrimental effect. Nothing toxic, nothing remotely dangerous. So, no more doom and gloom. With climate restoration featuring OPR combined with emissions reduction, we now have a way forward leading to a safe and flourishing world. And we're already on our way. It's already happening. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Alex, Peter, and Paul. And I've heard that it's 1 minute to midnight. And here's Alex from the Last Chance Saloon.
Oh yeah, there's this, 30 years from now, in 2051, this song I'm about to play will be written. and it'll be talking about, looking back on the early 21st century. Oh yeah, let me tell you about it. All right. It was a runaway train headed for a crash, out of control, gonna totally smash. All our hope was gone, or so it seemed. 'Cause our cities were all going underwater. Seemed like no way to save it for your son or daughter. It even just about almost fooled me. It was climate ruin. Hey, what were we doing? Yeah, Glasgow, what were we doing? We were messing everything up for everyone. But now it's climate restoration. We did the calculations, yeah. And now we're pulling out the CO2 by the gigaton. All right. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Come on now. Let me hear it. Hey. Oh, yeah. I feel it now. I said the powers that be were getting us in a panic. The lack of action was making us manic. But what kind of fools we mortals be? But we took control of the situation and instituted climate restoration. And everybody finally agreed to let it be. Yeah, we let it be. Climate restoration. Yeah, it's time for celebration. Yeah, woo! Because we did what Russ George said and restored the oceans to the max. Now, wait a minute. I feel it now. I feel a chant coming on now, a chant. I originally did this with Greta in Poland, a couple years ago at the COP in Poland. We were on a flatbed truck, and we did the chant. Everybody chanted. Coal, gas, and oil, we left it in the soil. Come on, everybody. Coal, gas, and oil, we left it in the soil. Let me hear you now. Coal, gas, and oil, left it in the soil, yeah. Coal, gas, and oil. All right. Yeah, we did. Now let me try a little more. Like maybe climate restoration is for the future generations. Climate restoration. We even saved the Arctic ice from elimination. Ocean pasture restoration. We gave our kids a healthy nation. It was climate ruin. But we saw that storm brewing back in 2021, sometime. Yeah, we really dodged a bullet back then. And I bet you thought it was all over, right? You gave up all your hope. But we got on the right road, not a moment too soon. That's right, we did the right thing.
Well, thank you so much for that. It may be the first time, I don't know, that we've had a rock and roll performance at the COP. So maybe that's another Guinness record for you, Alex. I'm not quite sure. But yes, thank you for your optimism, and thank you all for being here to hear about this ocean pasture restoration that Alex and the rest of the panel is so passionate about, for the promise that it seems to hold. And I also want to thank the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development, as well as the Buddhist Tzuchi Foundation and the International Society for Ecological Economics for allowing us to put this presentation on for you today. And thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
And we can thank Charles and Heidi, right? Do you think you could thank Charles and Heidi?
And let's thank Charles and Heidi here
Yes,
for
thank
helping
you.
put this all together for us.
And what about Stuart Scott?
And Stuart Scott.
Yeah.
Oh, and I thank you for ocean passion restoration.
Oh, there you go. All right, let's thank Russ George, too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Russ George.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
You got a little break of it. Leo, you give him a break, eh? Finish it off. Finish it off. All the way. You're going all the way at the end. Who's the leaving old mate boy in the old control room? Is that Nick? Nick's popping in. I don't know.